gentlemen, with your kind attention and permission, I have the honor of presenting to you one of the most remarkable men in the world. How remarkable? He's swift.
Hello. My name is Fritz KO, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Fritz KO Vids.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
But that has nothing to do with equality of outcome. Those things aren't even in the same conceptual universe. And to strive
what
for equality of outcome
is wrong with this guy? This is Scandinavia, motherfucker! You don't come to my country and talk like this.
Well, that is what people who think that the differences between people who are primarily culturally constructed believe. But it's not what the evidence suggests.
What the fuck?
Gavin McInnes often just makes points that are funny, yet when he was on the Joe Rogan show a few weeks ago, discussed various topics, and one point that came up was inbreeding in the Muslim world. However, unlike his mention of this on Fox News, this time his statement was more fleshed out and from a serious perspective.
And no one ever talks about this, but they have a major problem with inbreeding. They are marrying their first cousins again and again and again, and that makes your evolution go backwards.
Is this true? Where are you getting that from? I've never heard that before.
Consanguinity, I think it's called. Muhammad said it's okay to marry your first cousin.
For real?
And you do that once or twice, it's pretty bad. And you do it for 40 generations, and now you're going back in time.
This is your own theory.
No. Look at
Someone else
Muslims
has a theory?
and inbreeding, major problem.
I've never heard this before.
Especially with immigrants in Britain, like the Pakistanis in London. They'll have all kinds of serious inbreeding problems because that's an even smaller sample size you're dealing with.
Huh.
And every time I bring this up, people go, yeah, what about white people, hillbillies? They were inbreeding, or royalty, they were inbreeding. And I go, yeah. And it went real bad. It was a bad move. We learned the hard way. We saw Deliverance.
Drop yourself in for this. 70% of all Pakistanis are inbred. And in Turkey, the amount is between 25 to 30%. More stillbirths among immigrants. A rough estimate reveals that close to half of everybody living in the Arab world is inbred. A large percentage of the parents that, this is blowing my mind, large percentage of the parents that are blood, where's this coming from? What is this website?
I blog posted it before I came here.
PJ Media, but these are all the sources that went to this. This source is reproductivehealthjournal.com. This is a BBC investigation that went to it.
So listen to the BBC investigation in Britain several years ago revealed that at least 55% of the Pakistani community in Britain was married to a first cousin. The Times of India affirmed that, in quotes, this is thought to be linked to the probability that a British Pakistani family is at least 13 times more likely than the general population to have children with the recessive genetic disorders. Holy shit. BBC's research also discovered that while British Pakistanis account for just 3.4% of all births in Britain, they accounted for 30% of all British children with recessive disorders and a higher rate of infant mortality. What in the fuck? Labour Party MP has called for a ban on first cousin marriage. Medical evidence shows that one of the negative consequences of inbreeding is a 100% increase in the risk of stillbirths. One study comparing the Norwegians and Pakistanis showed that the risk of the child dying during labor increases by 50%. Wow. That is insane.
I also read somewhere that a lot of the symptoms of inbred people are irrational rage, fanaticism, and they end up just describing ISIS.
These are startling statistics, which may explain the problems with the Pakistani community in Britain, but they are far from the only nation in the Muslim world where this is a problem. According to Danish psychologist Nikolai Sennels, statistical research on Muslim countries shows high rates of blood-related marriages. For example, 46% in Bahrain, 33% in Egypt, 80% in Nubia, which is the southern region of Egypt, 60% in Libya, 64% in Jordan, 64% in Kuwait, 42% in Lebanon, 48% in Libya, 47% in Mauritania, 54% in Qatar, 67% in Saudi Arabia, 63% in Sudan, 54% in the United Arab Emirates, and 45% in Yemen, with often higher rates in Pakistan and Afghanistan, among other Muslim countries. Marriage with blood relatives is by no means exclusive to Islam, and was commonly practiced in these countries before Islam, with the most famous example being the Egyptian pharaohs. However, it is well known that the Prophet Muhammad married off his daughter to his cousin, and the Prophet himself married his first cousin. While this was accepted culturally at the time, the fact that this example is being followed in the modern age, in which we know the problems that this causes, is deeply worrisome due to the heavy immigration from many of these countries into Europe, which means that these countries will deal with the negative repercussions. Outside of the tremendous aforementioned increase in birth defects, according to a study conducted by the Indian National Science Academy, IQ in children born from blood-related marriages is found to be lower than those of outbred ones, with the IQ point difference being around 10 to 15 points. The onset of various social profiles, like visual fixation, social smile, sound seizures, oral expression, and hand grasping, are significantly delayed among the newborn inbred babies, according to the study. The negative impact upon the average intelligence of the region is hard to know, but it is likely to have been serious. Yet the EU and its globalist leaders continue to advocate for unfettered mass migration from these countries. And this is one more reason why the people of Europe need to close their borders, or at least monitor them more closely. Another study from the National Academy of Science shows that the risk of having IQ lower than 70 goes up 400%, from 1.2% in children with normal parents to 6.2% in children born from these marriages. An IQ lower than 70 is often considered mental retardation. Even in Denmark, a country which has taken measures to combat these relations, immigrant children are clearly represented in the special ed departments of schools. Europe must recognize the differences among those it lets in, because as Danish developmental psychologist Dr. Heimuth Norberg wrote in a 2011 academic journal, the average intelligence in Denmark, for example, is set to decrease due to the country's immigration patterns. Europe must recognize that its attitude of cultural relativism only promotes idiocracy.
What is happening, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a pantomime. I'd argue that Europe has done not too badly, considering the circumstances. In the middle of the last century, there was an almost negligible Muslim presence in Europe. At the turn of the 21st, in Western Europe alone, there were 15 to 17 million Muslims. That's a very fast migration, ladies and gentlemen, one of the fastest in human history. And no society would find it easy to deal with that kind of migration. As it happens, European societies, Western European societies have, I think, dealt with this much better than some would. Certainly, Muslims coming to live in Britain and in Western Europe enjoy more rights and better rights, among them freedom of worship, than they do in any Islamic country in the earth here today. We do have a problem. We have a problem when the failures of Islam throughout the world, the failures of all Islamic societies, come here into Britain. Their intolerance of freedom of conscience, their intolerance of apostates, their intolerance of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, their intolerance of minorities, other religious minorities, sexual minorities, their intolerance of gays, their dislike and distrust of half of the population, women, and many, many other things. And the call, what's more, for a parallel legal system within Britain and European societies. This is monstrous. No other group behaves like this, asks for parallel laws. This is a fundamental problem, and it's one we're going to have to deal with. It's a problem between a society, Western Europe, that believes that laws are based on reason, and Islam that believes that they are based on revelation. Between these two ideas, I'm not sure there is very much compromise for Europe. It is not Europe that has let down its Muslims, but the Muslims of Europe that have let down Europe. This is not solely something which we have to say we can never reconcile. Of course we can reconcile this, but we need to be honest about it. We need to be frank about it, and we cannot avoid things just because they are unpleasant. And if there were one thing I would wish Muslims in Europe could learn today, as fast as possible, it would be this: that you have no right in this society not to be offended. You have no right to say that because you don't like something, you can commit violence, or you would like something to be stopped or censored. You have no right to have more hate laws, or hate crime laws, or hate speech laws, just to defend Islam. You have to realize, the Muslims of Europe have to realize, that a society in which even your deepest feelings can be trodden upon is the only society worth living in. And the sooner we can learn that, the sooner that Islam can learn that within Europe, the better. It is not Europe that has failed its Muslims. It is Islam that has failed Europe. I'd argue Islam has failed its Muslims. Thank you.
I had a question to a few questions to Mr. Murray. I don't think it's the Muslims of Europe that have failed, the Muslims of Europe that have failed Europe. I think it's exactly the opposite. One of the things you said, it was actually a few Muslims, crazy Muslims, I think, who sort of flew the plane into those buildings. But was Hitler a Muslim by any chance? Because I'm not sure that Muslims had anything to do with the Holocaust.
You talked about how Europe has dealt with this problem, and what you basically have alluded to in the 6 minutes that you had are that Muslims are a problem. And you're from the organization called the Center for Social Cohesion, and it's worrying that to have you talk about these things in this manner. What you are basically alluding to is that Muslims are external to Europe, and it's worrying that you see it that way, because then that means there is no chance of there being any solution to any problem, or Muslims being seen as a part of Europe and being seen as European citizens. Thank you.
I just want to pick up something that Douglas Murray said. I'd like to ask you, when you talk about the Muslims that are the problem, which Muslims are you talking about? Because you keep slipping in your language to focus on the radicals, the extremists. Okay, maybe that's because that's what you're interested in. But there's another whole set of Muslims out there who are not like that.
I just want to make a quick comment to the throwaway comments made by Douglas Murray about Muslim women and Islam and its way it treats women. And I think that Muslim women are quite capable of speaking for themselves. And I think the sort of myths people like you put in the public arena, and I've heard other similar arguments from BNP and all that kind of stuff, they think it justifies their argument by saying, well, Islam treats 50% of its population in a really derogatory and whatever way that you like to explain it.
I'm a British female. I love this country and I give this country. Now you're calling me a problem. I don't think I am. I think you are. Second point is, as a Muslim female, okay, my parents might not let me go somewhere late at night because people are racist to me. They tell me to go back home and they hurt me. I got hit by 2 white guys and they laughed at me because I'm a scoffy, okay? Last point is to Mr. Fleming, about the point where you said about the religion, changing religion. Every person has the right to. No one says anything about that. But if you had a daughter or a son that wanted to become a Muslim, would you be happy about that? I don't think so.
Hypothetically speaking, Douglas Murray, what would you say to that lady?
No, of course it wouldn't bother me. I mean, I would hope that if somebody has access... Look, what Fleming and I are arguing for is that people have the right to access all of the kind of opinions, all of the knowledge that they can. That means, among other things, having, for instance, access to all of the criticism that should be written of the Quran and of Islam. And if they weigh up after knowing all of these things and having access to all of them that they would like to become Muslim, I don't have a problem with that.
All right. Good, you want?
I'd just like to make a comment on one of the cases that Petra made, which was about Ahmed Abu Talib, a very distinguished public figure in Holland. What you failed to mention when you mentioned him as a great success story of the Netherlands, which I agree he is that after the murder of Theo van Gogh in 2004, he had to go under 24-hour protection because his name was found on a hit list from a radical cell nearby. We cannot simply take, Petra, the terrific success stories and ignore things like that. It is no small thing that a Muslim politician who speaks out should be targeted for assassination in his home country of the Netherlands.
There are many Muslims and Muslims.
People are saying, you are welcome here, and then in their own country. I'm sorry, I'm at home. I'm at home. What are you talking about? Don't talk about. So, talk to me. I'm sorry. talk to us or talk to me as a fellow European and not as someone who is an outsider infiltrating the freedom of expression and using this. This is one. Let me finish.
Can I come back to that? No, I'm not saying you're not a European, but I would appreciate the following, which is that don't come to this hall and tell this hall that you're a European, and go to another and talk to an Islamic audience as Islamic brothers. Because that is what you have spent your career doing.
What's wrong?
Speaking through. Let me finish this. Let me finish this. And Tarek comes here one day and says, we fellow Europeans, we'll speak to each other as fellow Europeans. And another, he speaks to a Muslim audience and says, we as Muslims. Which is it, Tarek? Which is it?
I'm a Muslim.
You can't pretend you have two identities. Come just
you know what?
Can I say something about
But you are my...
Okay, you two, just a minute. Douglas, I want to ask you, you heard some of the people from the floor there, the woman complaining about attacks on her because she's described as a scarfie because she wears a head veil. I mean, that is something that you would regret. I mean, that doesn't promote social cohesion.
Nobody thinks that any physical attacks or any such thing could be a good thing to happen. Of course not. Of course, there are. Let's make sure we're right.
Talking about
prejudice exists in society. Let's just be absolutely clear as an audience. Prejudice undoubtedly exists in this society. It exists across racial groups, including from minorities to other minorities, after all, which is one of the things we see increasingly in Britain these days. And it is also the case that people, in particularly famously lower socio-economic groups, are likely to feel hatred for other groups. That is one of the things that has to be tackled, and everyone, I think, in this hall, I'm sure, we're in agreement that that should be tackled. But do not mix up somebody, a thug, a racist, and so on, attacking somebody in a street with the right of Fleming and me to say what we see in the Quran, what we think of Muhammad, and maybe even asserting our right to say so.
Okay, all right, now...
Just a comment to you, what you said about women. I think, first of all, that's really misleading because you're getting culture confused with religion. And if you just take a moment to look into the Quran, you'll see the Quran gave women rights long before women in Europe started burning bras for their own rights. And you'll also see that actually in the Quran it encourages women to seek education, it protects us from violence, and it actually gives us rights in marriage.
All right, okay.
So you're very wrong.
Your closing statements.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just to pick up on a couple of people, particularly women, who've said about the terrific things that Islam gives women in terms of rights. The first thing is, yes, in 7th century Arabia, some of this was progressive. In 21st century Britain, it is not. And you have to make that fundamental admission that the Quran is not a document for women's rights in Europe in 2010. It is not. Secondly, why is it that only Islamic societies and mosques in this country are places which teach and preach hatred of other minorities? Every single week in this country, there are people on campuses who teach the murder of minorities. Last week, it was somebody who calls for the murder of apostates. The week before, at another university, it was somebody who believes the Jews are fair game. This is not tolerable. It is not tolerable for Muslims. It is not tolerable from anyone else. You, I hope, would agree with me that any minority that engaged in such hatred and bigotry should be criticized. Don't pretend that the cloak of Islam and Islamic belief and religious fervor means that people like us cannot say that people who call for the murder of minorities are not mainstream, are not acceptable, and have to be critiqued.
So Europe is failing its Muslims. Against have won Douglas Murray and Fleming Rose. Congratulations to you.
I just read a paper that said that mathematics is whiteness. I didn't know that mathematics could have a race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the thing is, there's nothing illogical about these claims once you accept this central axioms. The axioms are straightforward. The world is a battleground of power hierarchies. That's what it is. There isn't anything else outside of that. And each power hierarchy generates its own internal narrative, including rules for what constitutes evidence that support and buttress the structure of that hierarchy. And because the hierarchies exclude, then it's in the best interests of the people who are excluded to invert the hierarchy. And of course, they also regard that as just, even though that's part of the incoherence of the entire argument. That's where they have to turn to Marxism. But make no mistake about it. This isn't accidental. It isn't people misunderstanding what constitutes evidence. Not at all.
Portray Islam and all Muslims as bad, but there's 1.8 billion Muslim followers of Islam. We have 8 million plus Muslim Americans in this country, and I don't see them represented here. But my question is, how can we fight an ideological war with weapons? How can we ever end this war? The jihadist ideology that you talk about, it's an ideology. How can you ever win this thing if you don't address it ideologically? Great question. I am so glad you're here, and I am so glad you brought that up because it gives us an opportunity to answer. What I find so amazing is, since the beginning of this panel, which we are here about Benghazi attack against our people, not one person mentioned Muslims. We are here against Islam, or we're launching war against Muslims. We are here to discuss how 4 Americans died and what our government is doing. We were not here to bash Muslims. You were the one who brought up the issue about most Muslims, not us. And since you brought it up, allow me to elaborate with my answer. There are 1.2 billion Muslims in the world today. Of course, not all of them are radicals. The majority of them are peaceful people. The radicals are estimated to be between 15 to 25% according to all intelligence services around the world. That leaves 75% of them are peaceful people. But when you look at 15 to 25% of the world's Muslim population, you're looking at 180 million to 300 million people dedicated to the destruction of Western civilization. That is as big as the United States. So why should we worry about the radicals, 15 to 25%? Because it is the radicals that kill. Because it is the radicals that behead and massacre. When you look throughout history, when you look at all the lessons of history, most Germans were peaceful. Yet the Nazis drove the agenda. And as a result, 60 million people died. Almost 14 million in concentration camps. 6 million were Jews. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at Russia, most Russians were peaceful as well. Yet the Russians were able to kill 20 million people. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at China, for example, most Chinese were peaceful as well. Yet the Chinese were able to kill 70 million people. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at Japan prior to World War II, most Japanese were peaceful as well. Yet Japan was able to butcher its way across Southeast Asia, killing 12 million people, mostly killed with bayonets and shovels. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. On September 11th in the United States, we had 2.3 million Arab Muslims living in the United States. It took 19 hijackers, 19 radicals, to bring America down to its knees, destroy the World Trade Center, attack the Pentagon, and kill almost 3,000 Americans that day. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. So for all our powers of reasons and us talking about moderate and peaceful Muslims, I'm glad you're here. But where are the others speaking out? And since you are the only Muslim representative, thank you. And since you are the only Muslim representative here, you took the limelight instead of speaking about why our government, I assume, are you an American? You're an American citizen. So as an American citizen, you sat in this room and instead of standing up and saying a question or asking something about our 4 Americans that died and what our government is doing to correct the problem, you stood there to make a point about peaceful moderate Muslims. I wish you brought 10 with you to question about how we can hold our government responsible. It is time we take political correctness and throw it in the garbage where it belongs and stop calling it.
Good evening. Just wanted to say thank you for coming to campus tonight and presenting your point of view. It's always valuable to have 2 sets of views going on at the same time. Very useful. My name is Jumana Imad Musa Ahmed Al-Bahri, and I'm a student here at UCSD. I was reading your literature. I found that much more interesting than the talk. And I found some interesting things about the MSA, which is an organization that's very active on campus, and it is hosting our annual Hitler Youth Week. You should come out to those events. If you could clarify the connection between the MSA and jihad terrorist networks, because last I checked, we had to do our own fundraising, and we never get help from anyone. So if you could clarify the connection between UCSD's MSA, or if you don't have such information, if you could connect other MSAs on UCs, because the connection wasn't too clear in the pamphlet. Just if you could clarify.
Okay. Will you condemn Hamas here and now?
I'm sorry, what?
Will you condemn Hamas?
Would I condemn Hamas?
As a terrorist genocidal organization?
Are you asking me to put myself on a cross?
So you won't. I actually have had this experience many times. You didn't read the pamphlet because the pamphlet is chapter and verse. The main connection is that the MSA is part of the Muslim Brotherhood network as revealed in the documents.
I don't think you understood what I meant by that. I meant if I say something, I'm sure that I will be arrested for reasons of Homeland Security. So if you could please just answer my question.
If you condemn Hamas, Homeland Security will arrest you.
If I support Hamas, because your question forces me to condemn Hamas. If I support Hamas, I look really bad.
If you won't condemn Hamas, obviously you support it. Case closed. I have had this experience, I had this experience at UC Santa Barbara where there were 50 members of the Muslim Students Association sitting right in the rows there. And throughout my hour talk, I kept asking them, will you condemn Hezbollah and Hamas? And none of them would. And then when the question period came, the president of the Muslim Students Association was the first person to ask questions. And I said, you know, before you start, will you condemn Hezbollah? And he said, well, that question is too complicated for a yes-no answer. So I said, okay, I'll put it to you this way. I'm a Jew. The head of Hezbollah has said that he hopes that we will gather in Israel so he doesn't have to hunt us down globally. For it or against it?
For it.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and showing everybody what's here. And you're wearing a terrorist neckerchief.
If you understood...
you didn't hear the lady.
Could you please answer my question?
You don't get to make a speech. Yes, sir.
I want to talk about oppression for a moment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm going to play a little clip here from one of your lectures so that we're really grounded in what you said.
You're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed. God only knows why. Maybe you're too short, or you're not as beautiful as you could be, or, you know, your grandparent was a serf, likely, because almost everybody's great-grandparent was. It's like, you know, and you're not as smart as you could be, and you have a sick relative, and you have your own physical problems, and it's like, frankly, you're a mess. And you're oppressed in every possible way, including your ancestry and your biology, and the entire sum of human history has conspired to produce victimized you with all your individual pathological problems. It's like, yes, true.
Do you ever worry that saying something like that might create a false equivalency between different kinds of oppression?
No, because I'm not willing to view the world through the oppression identity politics lens. And I think the fact that we do that virtually reflexively now is extraordinarily dangerous. You know, and even if there are ethnic differences in historical oppression on some timescales, which is undoubtedly true, that doesn't mean that we divide people into tribes now and we assign blame for those historical iniquities. All it'll do is tribalize us, and you can see that happening like mad in the West and in Europe right now. It's very dangerous.
I grew up in Toronto, and I'm just speaking from the perspective of someone who experienced, you know, like sort of systemic racial prejudice everywhere I went. You know, that's my framework. I don't know if it's neo-Marxism or postmodernism, or if it's just my reality.
I mean, there's arbitrary obstacles standing in people's way. Some of those have to do with gender. Some of them have to do with race and prejudice and bias and all that. But the landscape around us with regards to those things is improving very rapidly. It's much better than it has been in the past. And I still think that the proper way to construe the situation is to look to yourself as an individual. The fact that there are still places where prejudice is a problem is self-evident. People are tribal by nature.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace to you all. My name is Saba Ahmed. I'm a law student at American University. I am here to ask you a simple question. I know that we portray Islam and all Muslims as bad, but there's 1.8 billion Muslim followers of Islam. We have 8 million plus Muslim Americans in this country, and I don't see them represented here. But my question is, how can we fight an ideological war with weapons? How can we ever end this war? The jihadist ideology that you talk about, it's an ideology. How can you ever win this thing if you don't address it ideologically?
Great question. I am so glad you're here, and I am so glad you brought that up because it gives us an opportunity to answer. What I find so amazing is since the beginning of this panel, which we are here about Benghazi attack against our people, not one person mentioned Muslims. We are here against Islam, or we're launching war against Muslims. We are here to discuss how 4 Americans died and what our government is doing. We were not here to bash Muslims. You were the one who brought up the issue about most Muslims, not us. And since you brought it up, allow me to elaborate with my answer. There are 1.2 billion Muslims in the world today. Of course, not all of them are radicals. The majority of them are peaceful people. The radicals are estimated to be between 15 to 25%, according to all intelligence services around the world. That leaves 75% of them peaceful people. But when you look at 15 to 25% of the world Muslim population, you're looking at 180 million to 300 million people dedicated to the destruction of Western civilization. That is as big of the United States. So why should we worry about the radicals, 15 to 25%? Because it is the radicals that kill. Because it is the radicals that behead and massacre. When you look throughout history, when you look at all the lessons of history, most Germans were peaceful. Yet the Nazis drove the agenda. And as a result, 60 million people died. Almost 14 million in concentration camps. 6 million were Jews. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at Russia, most Russians were peaceful as well. Yet the Russians were able to kill 20 million people. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at China, for example, most Chinese were peaceful as well. Yet the Chinese were able to kill 70 million people. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. When you look at Japan prior to World War II, most Japanese were peaceful as well. Yet Japan was able to butcher its way across Southeast Asia, killing 12 million people, mostly killed with bayonets and shovels. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. On September 11th in the United States, we had 2.3 million Arab Muslims living in the United States. It took 19 hijackers, 19 radicals to bring America down to its knees, destroy the World Trade Center, attack the Pentagon, and kill almost 3,000 Americans that day. The peaceful majority were irrelevant. So for all our powers of reasons and us talking about moderate and peaceful Muslims, I'm glad you're here. But where are the others speaking out? And since you are the only Muslim representative, thank you. And since you're the only Muslim representative in here, you took the limelight instead of speaking about why our government, and I assume, are you an American? You're an American citizen. So as an American citizen, you sat in this room and instead of standing up and saying a question or asking something about our 4 Americans that died and what our government is doing to correct the problem, you stood there to make a point about peaceful, moderate Muslims. I wish you brought 10 with you to question about how we can hold our government responsible. It is time we take political correctness and throw it in the garbage where it belongs and stop calling it.
With the Prime Minister today declaring that he'd like to put a ban on the radical Islamic organisation Hizb ut-Tahrir, spokesman for the group, Wasim Darihi, joins me now. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
We've invited you here tonight to help Australians better understand what it is that you stand for. So tell me, first of all, do you support the murderous campaign being waged by Islamic State fighters in Iraq?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. There is an urgent need in this country to have quite open and honest conversation. I want to take a moment just to take a step back.
But I would like you to take this moment to my question, only because we'll have some time to go through a number of issues, and I don't want to run out of time.
We won't run out of time. We'll definitely address the most important and pertinent points. The first point is this, that when we discuss the events in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, our entry point shouldn't be what ISIS is doing or not doing. ISIS exists in a particular context. What's that context? That context is a century more of colonial occupation.
And I don't want to talk to you about the context at this point in time. I want you to address the very specific nature of my question, which is the tactics that this group is employing. Do you support them or not?
The fact that we don't want to have this discussion now is indicative of where the entire discussion around the war on terror narrative goes. The fact is, the entire response is what Muslims are doing or may not be doing. But no one legitimately or sincerely is discussing what Western governments are doing in the Muslim world. Groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda don't exist in a vacuum. They exist as a reaction to Western interference in the Islamic lands, and they view themselves, rightfully or wrongfully, irrespective of my opinion or otherwise, as a resistance effort to what they regard as an unjust occupation.
And with respect, many commentators all over the world have made that very point. What I'm asking you specifically is their tactics. Of course, people are angry. We understand that. But what I'm asking you is the tactic that's being employed to push back. Do you support it?
Well, let me explain something very clearly.
Answer my question, please.
I'll explain to you why the question itself is quite disconcerting. Because what we're talking about is a particular reality where millions have lost their lives. Countries have been destroyed.
You are clearly
homes,
obfuscating, and I did not invite you onto this program.
I reject the accusation. I'll say very clearly.
Why will you not point blank condemn the actions of IS
because
fighters?
The question itself is
men
offensive.
who cut off the heads of innocent journalists and aid workers. Why will you not take the opportunity? You have a national platform here. Why don't you adopt the leadership that many have obviously given you responsibility for?
Why won't you allow me to answer the question that I deem appropriate? I've answered the question quite directly. We're talking about a reality in which millions have lost their lives directly as a consequence of the foreign policies of countries like Australia.
And made that point,
but
and
what
I
hasn't been made,
to make
what
that
hasn't
point.
been made is what are we going to do about it?
Will make
there
their own judgments
and of course they will.
The
and I have absolute trust in the Australian population.
And now I would just draw you back to my question.
Yeah, and I'll keep repeating the same point. This cannot possibly be our entry point in this discussion. Because why is the attention on ISIS, what ISIS is doing or not doing? Our position on ISIS is very clear. Our position on ISIS was released years before Tony Abbott wanted to make it a political issue.
Okay, for those who haven't read it, tell me.
We come from a very clear perspective. Our moral compass is not based on political expediency. Assad has been slaughtering hundreds of thousands, and Tony Abbott has not moved a single fighter jet to oust him from his position. How are we supposed to believe that this current mission is a humanitarian one when
because we were invited in by a legitimately elected government in Iraq?
The question is on a matter of principles.
Syria is in the midst of a civil war. That is a separate conversation to the one we are discussing here.
We're talking principles.
I am discussing with you the tactics of a group that is masquerading
and of course it's
behind a religion which many people who follow that religion do not agree with and in fact condemn. People like community leaders here in Australia like Dr. Jamal Rifi who has publicly condemned the actions of Islamic State. Why won't you do the same?
My clear position is that we took a clear position on ISIS long before Western politicians wanted to use ISIS as the latest bogeyman. Let's not forget that 1 million people lost their lives based on a lie. Let's not forget the whole charade around the weapons of mass destruction.
I don't think people forget that, and there have been
Tony Abbott is wanting us to believe that the greatest threat to all of us is the actions of a group, of a handful of individuals, and no one wants to discuss what has caused the death of 1 million civilians in Iraq?
Are you outraged by the image of an Australian-born child of 7 years old holding up 7 heads like trophies in Iraq or Syria?
Let me tell you what I am outraged by.
So you won't even answer that question.
Are you going to allow me to answer the question? Are you going to allow me to answer the question? If you wanted a one-way discussion,
no.
If you wanted a one-day discussion,
I think you're the one who wanted the one-way discussion.
You did not necessarily have to invite me.
I am asking you legitimate questions, which you have obviously come here knowing you didn't want to answer.
Because you're not getting the answer you want. Because you're not getting the answer you want.
In many cases, I just want a yes or no.
Let me make it very clear. You've invited me onto this platform to express my views.
Yes.
You're not allowing me to do that.
But you want to express your views quite separate to the questions that I'm putting to you.
I'm answering the question that I deem appropriate.
Okay, let me ask you a different question, and let's see if you might engage with that one. Your group is calling for a caliphate governed by Sharia law. What would that look like in Australia?
This is the absurdity of this entire discussion. Why is the focus, given the context of the war on terror, entirely upon what Muslims are doing or not doing?
Okay, let me ask you another one. Okay, you're not going to engage with that one.
No, let me be very clear. Just because you don't get the answer you want, just because I'm not reinforcing an Islamic phobic narrative that justifies the wholesale slaughter of entire populations.
Any supposed
I'm explaining the context in which this entire discussion is happening.
Putting a line in the sand
all you're doing is reinforcing the view.
Yes or a no about what your position
to talk over each other. Your job is to ask the questions and to listen to my response. If you wanted to push an agenda, let's swap seats.
But
if you wanted a
my job is
communicated
not
position,
to ask questions and
of
have you
course it is.
answer something entirely different.
Your job is to ask a question and to canvass my opinions. That's why I was introduced into this program. If you wanted to dictate my response, if you wanted to dictate terms of acceptability, then take my position. But ask me a question and at least afford me the respect for the opportunity to answer it. I come from a very clear point of view that as Muslims, we have a fixed moral compass that says it's unequivocally, under any conditions, it's an aberration to kill innocent civilians. Tony Abbott cannot say that. John Howard dismissed the slaughter of 500,000.
Okay, let's
dismissed the
knock
slaughter
down.
of 500,000 civilians as an embarrassment. Let's talk about morality here. Let's talk about who is the greatest threat
I think people
to
are
civilian
very
life.
clear of your point of view. They're clear on that point of view. You've expressed it a number of times.
Yes.
Now
And
let
what's
me
my
ask
message?
you
My
this.
message is this is where the discussion needs to be.
Will you take this opportunity now to urge young Muslim men here in Australia not to join Islamic State fighters in
And
Iraq
I'll
and
answer it the
Syria?
exact same way. The war on terror narrative works in this way. It presents the West as the good guy and Muslims as the bad guy, and we are what represents an existential threat to the entire world. That's an absurdity. It is not Muslims who are flying B-52s. It is not Muslims who are dropping bombs from their fighter jets. It is not Muslims who are occupying foreign lands.
But it
don't
is
come to
Islamic
me,
State
no,
fighters
don't come to me
who
and
are
pretend
killing
that the greatest
Muslims.
threat to all
They're
of us.
killing Christians.
We're talking about
They're
opinion.
murdering Kurds.
I'm glad you raised that point. Do you know why? Because how are we expected to believe that the West is concerned about the life of minorities when it is the majority that is being slaughtered? How are we supposed to take those arguments seriously? How are we supposed to take the moral compass seriously when people like Madeleine Albright dismisses lives of 500,000 or 1 million through
just
sanctions?
one question that I
I'm
asked
answering
you,
very clearly.
specifically addressing the question I'm asking you.
Just because you don't like the answer doesn't mean I'm not answering the question.
But will you do me a favour and answer one question?
I'm doing the public a great favour by refocusing this discussion where it needs to be. Ask yourselves very clearly, the Australian public, I believe in the Australian public more than Tony Abbott does. I believe
What do you think the Australian
that as
public
human
will
beings,
make?
they will
What will the
identify
Australian
with
public
innocent
make
life
of the fact that
taken
you
wrongly
will
anywhere
not?
around the world.
What will
They
the
understand this
Australian
point.
public make of the fact that you will not sit here and tell your fellow Muslim men not to join Islamic State fighters in Iraq and Syria?
I believe 100% that the Australian public will see through the rhetoric. Tony Abbott and others who adopt his script are famous for their dog whistle politics, are famous for their policies around marginalisation and xenophobia. That's not some great new revelation. They campaign on this basis specifically because they don't want to confront the truth. And the truth is, it is not Muslims who are occupying foreign lands. It is not Muslims who are killing millions of civilians. And it is not Muslims who are shaking hands with barbaric tyrants.
Foreign lands?
Barbaric
Where
tyrants.
Are we occupying
after
foreign
300,000
lands?
lives
Okay, now
have
I'm
been lost
engaging
in
with
Syria.
your comments. Where are we?
Iraq, Afghanistan.
We're not
supporting
occupying
an
Iraq.
international architecture that enslaves entire populations.
We're not occupying Iraq.
You can place whatever spin you like. We live it.
The
we
democratically elected government in Iraq has invited us in.
And that's why, as a Muslim, I'm telling the Australian public the reality of what this government is doing in our lands. We live it. It's not an academic exercise.
No, you're living in Australia.
It's
you're
not
an
about
Australian
points.
resident.
It's not about point
you're
scoring.
An Australian citizen.
The Australian public
you're
needs
not
to
living
know.
anything
We need
in
to
Iraq.
have an honest conversation about what this government is doing in your name. And it is frightening. John Howard dismissed 500,000 lives as a mere embarrassment, and he did it in the people's name.
In your name.
In the people's name. And this is the dilemma. You want the focus, you want the world to believe that what is of greatest concern is what a handful of individuals are doing in response
like
to what is being done upon them.
There are about 30,000
Let's
now.
talk
we're being
about
told.
the other
It's hardly
side.
a
Let's talk about the fact that they exist as a reaction to what exists on the ground. What exists on the ground? Foreign occupation. political
Does that
repression.
justify beheading? Does that justify the slaughter
Does that justify
of innocence?
the subjectivity around this discussion? Why don't you condemn what the Australian government is doing? Why don't you condemn what the American government is doing? Why don't you condemn the innocent killing of the million lives in Iraq and Afghanistan? Why don't you do that? Why don't you hold the government to account?
We're out of time, surprise.
So when you and, say, Sam Harris argue about religion, you're arguing about fundamentally different things, it sounds like. His conception of what is religious is very different from yours.
Yeah, well, he tends to think of religious thought the same way that a smart 13-year-old atheist thinks about a fundamentalist Christian. It's like, yeah, okay. You're just not getting to the heart of the matter. You know, and I just finished reading all of Sam's books in the last couple of weeks. And as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't ever get to the bottom of the issue. He doesn't address the fundamental thinkers. There are some profound thinkers. Dostoevsky's one, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Jung. It's like they're completely absent from, and the same with Dawkins. It's completely absent. All that conceptualization is completely absent from their corpus of works. They don't even have an understanding for the psychological utility of religion. And it's a big problem. You know, you don't get to be an atheist when the people you attack are like naive fundamentalists. And I have some sympathy for the naive fundamentalists. It's like what they're basically saying is something like this. Look, we have an ethos that's valuable. You scientist types are casually dismantling it. What the hell are we supposed to do? Well, the fundamentalists don't know what to do about that. So they say, well, creationism is science. It's like, well, no, it's not. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a point. Their point is there's something valuable here. It's like, don't break it casually. What are you going to replace it with? The new atheists wish that everybody becomes rational. It's like, yeah, sure, that's going to happen.